My name is Marie Logan, and I work with Food and Water Watch and Salmonaid Foundation. And I'm here today to talk to you all about genetically modified salmon. It's an emerging risk to wild salmon populations and to human health. And I'll also educate you all on some of the ways that you can help us stop this fish before it reaches the market. So I work at Food and Water Watch. We're a national nonprofit consumer advocacy organization, and we do work that challenges corporate control of food and water resources. We do work to keep it in public hands. We do a lot of work from behind-the-scenes research to policy analysis and community organizing throughout the nation. And we advocate policies that guarantee safe food, clean water, and healthy oceans. We have offices in Washington, D.C. and San Francisco, which is where I'm based, and satellite offices throughout the country. In addition to my work with Food and Water Watch, we also work with Salmonaid Foundation. This is a pretty broad coalition of West Coast organizations, everything from environmental river protection groups to Native American tribes, commercial fishing organizations, and sport fishermen. And we're all united around the shared cause of wild salmon protections and protection for the rivers that they depend upon. So I'm here today on behalf of both of those organizations and going to be talking about genetically engineered salmon. Most of you may have heard by now that the Food and Drug Administration is considering approval of a genetically engineered creature that would be the first ever genetically engineered animal for human consumption. And there are a number of different concerns that I wanted to outline for all of you here today, including the risks to wild fish and the environment, the risks to the commercial fishing industry, and the risks to consumers and human health. So I'll be outlining all of those today, and then moving on to a discussion of what we can do to stop this fish before it is approved. And a quick note of clarification, you may hear me using genetically engineered and genetically modified interchangeably. They have essentially the same meaning. So let's start with the how this fish is produced. There are ocean pout. They're deep water, cold water fish. And scientists have spliced genes from an ocean pout that produce antifreeze. These antifreeze genes allow the fish to survive in very cold water. This fish is a very, very distant relative of salmon. In fact, it would never have the potential to be able to breed naturally in the wild with these fish. And the genes that produce antifreeze from the ocean pout have been spliced into a Pacific Chinook salmon. The Pacific Chinook salmon has a growth promoter gene that allows the fish to continue growing at a more rapid rate than regular wild salmon. All of these are spliced into a third fish, the Atlantic salmon, which is the salmon you see on the market today in any sort of farmed variety. Atlantic salmon is essentially farmed salmon when you see it in stores or in restaurants. So that's sort of the how. Now let's get into the why. Well, the company that produces this is called Aqua Bounty. They're based out of Massachusetts, and they have publicly stated that they believe this fish will help to address world food insecurity. At Food and Water Watch and at Salmonaid, we're pretty concerned that this is a fallacious argument. It's one we've seen in the company's press releases in the media. You know, the fundamental argument that you can produce food to feed the world with genetic modification is questionable at best, and in particular when it comes to farmed salmon. Even regular farmed salmon require 2, 3, even 4 pounds of wild fish for each pound that they grow, and the ratio would be even more skewed for a genetically engineered salmon that grows faster and therefore requires more nutrients. So if you envision the small fish that make up the base of the food chain, the sardines, the mackerel, anchovy, herrings, those sorts of fish, menhaden, all of these fish form the base of the food chain. They're essential to a productive ecosystem. And when these fish are captured en masse and ground up and produced into fish oil and fish meal and fed to farmed fish, what you end up with is a net marine imbalance in terms of the protein that you're putting in versus what you're getting out. So the idea that this fish, this genetically modified fish, will help to feed the world is a very questionable argument. Secondly, Aqua Bounty's Frankenfish, what we like to call it, is really promoting an industrial food production system, and we're pretty concerned about that. As far as the factory fish farming industry goes, it's expanding. Farmed salmon has been growing since the 1990s, and especially in countries like Norway and Chile, and even here in Washington off our coasts here. So what we're concerned about is we see this factory farming model that has been so deleterious on land, that model is being exported to our oceans, and to pretty significant detriment. And finally, AquaBounty is intending to profit off of this fish. Naturally, they're a company, they're not a nonprofit. And there are some pretty deep moral and ethical problems when a company intends to profit off of a form of engineered life. And I would even argue this is fundamentally different from what we see with genetically engineered crops. This is a living, breathing creature, and they would own the genetic material that produces this new species. So those are some of the arguments as to why the fish is being produced. Scale of difference of this fish. Because it has the growth promoter gene and the antifreeze gene, it's able to grow even during the cold winter months, and that's what makes this fish fundamentally different from a natural salmon. So because of all of these issues, I want to talk about some of the impacts that there are on the environment and on wild fish populations. The first has to do with escapes, and I've already mentioned before that the farmed salmon industry is pretty notorious in terms of environmental destruction. The same would hold true of a genetically engineered salmon, but the risks are even more magnified. So AquaBounty has claimed that they intend to produce fish in a land-based farming environment. However, this is a company's promise that's not backed up by any legislation or requirements by the Food and Drug Administration, which is currently reviewing this fish. So whether or not it actually follows through on this is open to its own discretion, essentially. Even if they do hold to their claim that they will produce these fish in land-based farms, it is important to consider that the examples that we've seen in the environment in the past 40 years. For example, in the 1960s, there were pink salmon being grown in closed containment facilities on land in Michigan off of the Great Lakes. And what happened there was essentially human error. There was a pool of wastewater that the technicians there managed to flush out into a local stream. What they didn't realize was that there were viable salmon eggs in that production system that then managed to grow and propagate and establish a viable population in the Great Lakes. That's just one example. They never intended to introduce the fish to that ecosystem, but they are now there. The same could hold true of this new genetically engineered salmon. All it takes is one mistake, one time that there has been human error, and we will have this fish in the environment. The company's attempts to assuage consumers that their fish are low risk shouldn't fool you. You should really be thinking twice about what these promises actually mean. When it comes to sterility, the company has promised that the fish will be sterile, but at what rate can we actually guarantee sterility? The company says they can achieve about 95% sterility rates. Is that really enough, though? If they're talking about sales of 10 million eggs, like they were in 2001, that would be 500,000 fertile eggs that could develop into fish that can then escape. And again, all it takes is one escape to introduce this foreign genetic material into the environment. These are all some of the concerns that we have around the environmental risks of this new species. And finally, there's the Trojan gene hypothesis. There is a scientist who has published research indicating that if a genetically engineered fish manages to escape into the wild, it could lead to the extinction of wild fish and farmed genetically engineered salmon fish within 40 generations. So that is a pretty significant number to consider, especially when you know that the typical salmon life cycle is about 3 to 5 years, sometimes just 2. So that could happen pretty quickly. So let's move on to some of the impacts that we foresee with regards to commercial fishing. There could be a lower consumer demand if consumers fear seeing this product on the market, especially given the fact that it is not currently required to be labeled. That's something I'll be getting into in a little bit. But for now, keep that in mind. If this fish does manage to be approved, then we could end up with consumers who are avoiding salmon entirely just because they don't know and they're concerned about the risks to their own health and to the environment of consuming this fish. Food and Water Watch commissioned a poll last November of 2010, and we found that 78% of consumers don't want to eat genetically engineered fish, and that's a very significant number. It cut across party lines, it cut across gender, everything basically that you could account for. It's a pretty wide-standing opposition that we are seeing to genetically engineered fish in the marketplace. Another thing to consider is that this fish could really impact commercial fishing as an industry, and that's a huge cause for concern because it brings billions into our economy every year, especially in coastal areas in the West Coast and Alaska. So one thing I'd like to introduce is the problem that we saw in Alaska in the 1990s, when the farmed salmon industry was just beginning to sort of develop internationally in places, as I mentioned, like Chile and Norway. What happened was, as that industry began to blow up and really export that factory farming model onto the oceans, we saw a glut of farmed salmon on the marketplace. And this was before we had an idea of the environmental concerns. The general education wasn't out there yet about what the risks this fish could have. And so what happened was the prices plummeted for commercial fishermen, and a number of them went out of business. They were no longer able to fish for salmon because there was no competition in the marketplace with regards to a fish that could be produced artificially cheaper with externalized costs on the environment. So it took about 10 years, maybe a full decade really, for wild salmon to regain the price premium that it now has for being a higher quality fish that's healthier for you and for the environment. As far as other risks to commercial fishing industries, there is, of course, the risk of genetic pollution and the risk that this fish could, the genetically engineered salmon, could pollute genetic diversity in wild stocks and perhaps lead to a lack of competition. And finally, there's the Monsanto problem. The question of who owns this fish. There are rumors that Monsanto goes after farmers whose fields have been contaminated by genetically engineered crops that they didn't plant. The same thing could potentially hold true. This is speculation, but there's risk that if Aqua Bounty owns this fish and the genetic material, and it manages to escape into the environment, interbreed with wild stocks, and a commercial salmon fisherman catches a fish and it is found to have the Aqua Bounty marker in it, the marker gene, who owns that fish? That's the question. These are all some of the concerns that we have around the commercial impact. Next, I wanted to touch on some of the concerns to human health and the reasons why a lot of people are refusing to eat this fish if it makes it to market. The first thing I already mentioned is that it's not required to be labeled right now. The next thing is that there have been really inadequate studies as regards to whether this fish is suitable for consumption. Just to start it off, basically the Food and Drug Administration approval process is really flawed. So they have no protocol to analyze genetically engineered animals, and so they're considering this application as if it were a veterinary drug. So if you can just sort of imagine that, essentially what that means is the same process that a hormone might go through in order to be approved for injection into cows to help them produce more milk. That's the same means by which they are intending to evaluate this genetically engineered fish. We think that's very concerning. It has huge implications on human health. And as far as the actual studies that have been done, there have been 4 that the FDA has evaluated publicly. One of those is an academic study that is 20 years old, so clearly out of date with modern technology. And the other 3 were all commissioned by the company that intends to profit off of this fish. They're all commissioned by Aqua Bounty. So what we've seen is some really, just a lack of basic independent evaluation of whether this genetically engineered salmon is going to be safe for the human diet, nutrition, how it's digested. All of these things are cause for concern. There is a risk of allergenicity and a risk that this fish could have higher levels of hormones. So to explore that briefly, a consumer who might be allergic to the eel-like ocean pout might not know that they are eating a genetically engineered salmon that contains those genes, and it could lead to an expansion of seafood allergies, something that we're concerned about, especially given the fact that it's not required to be labeled. Consumers won't have the ability to choose to avoid this fish in the marketplace, except by the knowledge that this fish will be farmed exclusively until or unless it manages to make it into the wild. And finally, there is a risk of lower omega-3s. As I mentioned, this company that's producing this fish wants to take a bad industry, the salmon farming industry, and make it worse. Farmed salmon are already known for having lower omega-3s than their wild counterparts, and the same could hold true of the genetically engineered salmon. In fact, it probably will, because they'll be fed the same feed, whether it's farmed or genetically engineered. There are more contaminants in concentrated feed that is being produced for salmon farms. So when I mentioned those small marine fish earlier, those fish that are ground up and produced into fish meal and fish oil, those fish, the small marine fish, are fed as pellets to the farmed salmon. Those same pellets would be used to feed the genetically engineered fish. And when you concentrate that many fish in such a small pellet form, you end up with possibly higher levels of mercury, PCBs, other contaminants that can be harmful to human health. So again, this fish will pose a number of risks to humans, and that's why we're very concerned about this fish making it into the marketplace. So with all of these risks that I've just outlined, I think the question that a bunch of you are thinking of right now is, how soon could this actually happen? So the Food and Drug Administration has circulated an internal memo earlier this month that recommends approval. It's been in the media a little bit, but that's still behind the scenes. This document is headed to the Office of Management and Budget next, and approval could come as soon as the end of this year. So this is a worst-case scenario, to be sure. The FDA is not under any obligation to complete its analysis under any set timeline. In fact, they've been sitting on certain applications for upwards of 10 years. But if this fish is approved by the FDA, there are all the risks that I already outlined to consumers, to the environment, and to the commercial fishing industry. These are all concerns that we have. With all of that in mind, I wanted to talk as well about how we can stop this fish. The good news is that there are a lot of different venues to stop it before it's approved. There's a lot of important legislation to support, so I'm going to outline 3 different categories of legislation that we are working on with Food and Water Watch, with Salmon Aid, and a coalition of groups that are opposed to this genetically engineered salmon. The first category of these is Senate Bill 229 and its counterpart in the House, HR 520. These bills would require labeling of genetically engineered salmon. What we foresee is that if this fish is approved, consumers are going to need some sort of protection to know when this fish is in the marketplace and make sure that it's labeled as such. That's good, but it's also not enough. We'd much rather see an outright ban, and that's why we're supporting Senate Bill 230 and its corresponding bill, HR 521. These bills would ban genetically engineered salmon altogether by deeming it unsafe for human health, and anything that is unsafe for human health, the FDA is not allowed to approve. Finally, there's a new piece of legislation that just came out this week. That's Senate Bill 1717 that would ban interstate commerce of this fish, which is essentially equivalent to a ban because the fish would require production in multiple states in order to be sold. And that's something over which Congress has the authority to regulate. These are all pieces of legislation that we're working to support. I would encourage you all to take action today. I've left postcards at all of your tables. They're the pink and purple ones you'll see. And if you sign this petition, it goes to your senator and representative. We make sure that they get that. And it urges President Obama not to allow the Food and Drug Administration to approve the fish. The good news is that we do have an opportunity to make a difference. And in fact, I've got some good news to report on this front. Just in the last week, I mentioned that I'm out of San Francisco, and we've been working on our California senators. Since they tend to lead the way in environmental protection issues, we've been pressuring them to sign on to this legislation, and it has worked. Just this week, Senator Feinstein announced that she will support Senate Bill 230, the bill that will ban genetically engineered salmon, and that's an excellent first step. We are still working on Senator Boxer. She hasn't yet taken a position on Senate Bill 230. However, she did just this week sign on to the labeling legislation. So there is movement, and a lot of that came in response to the thousands of consumers who voiced concern about this fish. We set up a phone line that went directly to their offices. We delivered thousands of petitions in meetings with their district offices. All of these things make a difference, and they need to hear from people like us to make sure that we know, they know how we feel about the risks of this new species. And so I wanted to connect you all with a couple of resources that we have. At Food and Water Watch's website, that's foodandwaterwatch.org, we have a number of research materials that we're making available to everyone. There's an overview document called Frankenfish that you can read that sort of touches on all of the concerns that I've already mentioned today. There's also an issue brief that's specific to sort of rebutting the argument that genetically engineered salmon is going to solve world food insecurity. And finally, a report that we just released last week titled Genetically Engineered Food, an Overview. All of these materials are accessible online for free, and you can check us out at foodandwaterwatch.org. So with that, I would like to turn around to questions. I want to make sure that this is interactive and that you all understood everything that I covered today because it was a lot. And I'm happy to take any questions at this time.
Like recommending...
Yeah. It's internal at this point, so it hasn't been formally released. But what the media is reporting is that the memo did recommend approval. From there, the best recourse that we have is to encourage our legislators to get on board with the legislation that I recommended because they will have a more direct chance of stopping this rather than pressuring the FDA. I'm not certain what happens after the OMB step, but if they deem it safe, and according to the OMB-OIRA will be the authority probably that's reviewing this. After they approve it, it should essentially become a public decision, and the FDA will release a document and require comments on that. However, the important thing to consider about the FDA as a federal agency is that it's not directly accountable to the people, whereas our senators are. So our senators are the people that we're focusing on at Food and Water Watch to make sure that they protect us from the risks of this new fish. I try to keep track, but because there's a lot of legislation, I sometimes fall behind. Senate Bill 1717 is brand new. It has several co-sponsors already, including, I think, Senator Murkowski out of Alaska, and I believe it was sponsored by Senator Begich. And the labeling bill, as it happens, is more popular because it is sort of an easier ask, but we're really encouraging our senators to sign on to the ban legislation because we believe that's far more protective. I've got all the numbers printed out for you in terms of which legislators are signed on to which, and I'm happy to share that with you after the conference. So, other questions? Yeah. There are independent scientists who have been reviewing this fish, and they have been releasing those reports, but it's sort of coming down to a he said, she said, and the FDA is, at this point, not considering any outside analysis. What we're hoping to encourage them to do is more independent, more rigorous analysis than that which I already mentioned. But to my knowledge, I don't know of any universities that are pursuing that, but that doesn't preclude them from actually doing it right now. So, yeah. In the blue right here?
Yes, I heard that the study based is...
That's another excellent point. When it came to the fish that the FDA actually studied, I mentioned that there was very little analysis. The company that produces frankenfish, Aqua Bounty, has had the opportunity to cull any deformed or diseased fish prior to the analysis. The argument for that was that because we wouldn't be eating these deformed fish anyways, that they don't need to be analyzed, but that doesn't actually answer the question of what the percentage rates of disease are within the population of genetically engineered fish. So if there are very high rates of disease and deformity, then certainly that should be considered in the study. And so because they were able to cull and eliminate any fish from the discussion that they didn't want, there were an abysmally small number. I think it was maybe 8 or 10 fish that they did actually analyze. So that's another very good point to bring up. So, other questions?
Do you know if frankenfish is trademarked? So if we did anything, NPA?
That's a good question. To my knowledge, it's not. At Food and Water Watch, we've been using that phrase, and so has the Center for Food Safety that we're working with very closely on this issue. To my knowledge, it's not a trademarked thing, but we can talk about that. Yeah, in the white back there.
I understand that no matter what the fish farmers do, there's a small percentage of fish that get away in the wild if it breeds.
Absolutely. I mean, there are millions of escapes from salmon farms every year, and as I've mentioned, Aqua Bounty wants to take a bad industry and make it worse. And there's no guarantee that these fish won't escape. In fact, it's almost guaranteed that with time, there will be some sort of human error, some sort of escape, an earthquake incident, something like that, that will eventually release these fish into the wild. With existing salmon aquaculture, about 90 to 95% of salmon farming is done in open waters. That's usually estuaries or areas where freshwater and marine ocean water meet. And that's done in places like the coasts of Washington, the fjords of Norway. And there are documented millions of fish that escape every year. So.
Well, generally, they try to keep them close to shore so that the tidal action and storms don't rupture the netting.
Absolutely. The salmon farming industry is very polluting when you consider the fact that they're cramming so many fish into such a small contained area and then pumping feed in the form of pellets. This can produce a lot of waste, and all the excretions, all of that can really pollute an area, especially when it is a protected area, as you mentioned, which they often favor so that it is more protected from the risk of tearing and that sort of thing in the nets. It's true. In an era of corporate dominance, there are a lot of companies looking to evade environmental laws and statutes, and it may end up being cheaper for them to pay the fines rather than to stop doing whatever they're doing. It's certainly a cause for concern. At Food and Water Watch, in addition to fighting frankenfish, we are also fighting the factory fish farming industry, which has been trying to export, as I mentioned, the factory farm model into the oceans in these massive cages, as large as 8 stories tall in some cases. This is already being tested in the waters off the coast of Hawaii, and we're fighting to keep this industry from developing out here on the West Coast. A couple of years ago, we fought and successfully stopped, for now, a fish farm down in San Diego that would have been really enormous, producing a carnivorous finfish that would require, again, an enormous amount of fish feed input in order to produce the final output. It's a concerning trend, and that's why we fight these issues at Food and Water Watch, is to keep our oceans safe and our food healthy and our waters clean. So, other questions? Yeah. I'm not an expert on the actual process going forward with within the FDA, so I'd have to look that up and get back to you. But to my knowledge, there is generally a comment period of some degree.
So there's opportunity for the public to express their opinion there.
There may be, but again, the problem with a federal agency is that it reports to the administration in charge. And unfortunately, what we've seen is that the Obama administration has been very gung-ho on approving genetically modified foods of many kinds. I mean, just in the last few years, I'll try and remember, but sweet corn has just been approved this month. That would be the very first corn that would be approved for human consumption directly. The other forms of corn that Monsanto has produced typically go into animal feeds. Other products that have been approved by the Obama administration in the past few years, gosh, I'll try and remember, but they were sugar beets, alfalfa was a big one. I mean, there have been just a stream of them in the last several years. So we're getting the feeling that this administration is very favorable towards genetically modified organisms, and that's a cause for concern. And that's why we think that recourse to our federal entities may be a more direct route to our legislators, to people who are directly accountable to us, may be better than pressuring the FDA.